You're standing at the kitchen sink on a Wednesday night, rinsing a pot from dinner, and your wife, Renata, is at the table behind you going through the mail, and she holds up an envelope from your brokerage firm, the quarterly statement you always intercept before she sees it, except tonight you were slow, distracted, half listening to the news on the counter radio, and she's already got it open. You don't turn around right away. You finish rinsing the pot, set it in the rack, and you can feel, even with your back to her, the specific quality of silence that means she's actually reading the number, not just glancing at the envelope the way she usually does before handing you your mail without a second thought. "Is this right?" she asks, finally, and her voice isn't accusing, not yet, just genuinely confused, the voice of someone doing math that isn't adding up against a life she thought she understood completely. You turn around. 21 years married, and this is the conversation you always knew, somewhere in the back of your mind, you'd eventually have to have, arriving now on an ordinary Wednesday, over a rinsed pot and a dish towel still in your hand, instead of at some moment you'd have chosen and rehearsed. $20.3 million, across investments you built quietly over 16 years, starting with a modest inheritance from your own father that you never fully disclosed the size of, growing through decisions Renata knew about only in the vaguest outline. "The market's been good to us," you'd say, when she asked, which was true, technically, the way most of the things you've told her for 2 decades have been technically true and completely incomplete at the same time. The lie was never really a lie. It was 1,000 small, accurate statements, arranged carefully enough that the true picture never quite assembled itself in her mind, and you built that arrangement so slowly, over so many years, that you almost forgot you were building it at all. This is the part almost nobody explains honestly about a marriage that holds a secret like this one. It doesn't usually happen because of one dramatic decision to deceive. It happens one reasonable-sounding omission at a time, each one small enough to justify on its own, until the total distance between what your spouse believes and what's actually true becomes larger than either of you would have agreed to if you'd been asked to build it all at once. You go back, standing there at the sink with the dish towel still in your hand, to the actual beginning of it, 16 years earlier, because the honest starting point matters more than the moment it finally gets discovered. Your father died when you were 29, 3 years into the marriage, and left you something you genuinely had no idea was coming, a modest but real inheritance, the result of decades of quiet, disciplined investing he never once discussed with you or your siblings, discovered only after his death, in a will that surprised the whole family with its size. You remember the specific instinct that arrived almost immediately, before you'd even fully processed the grief. Don't tell Renata the real number yet. Not out of distrust of her, not exactly. Out of something harder to name, a private need to sit with the money alone first, to understand what it actually meant before you let anyone else's reaction shape how you felt about it. You told her a version of the truth, that your father had left you something, that it was helpful, that you'd be putting it toward investments rather than spending it, all true, all carefully incomplete. She never pushed for the exact figure, partly out of respect for your grief, partly, you suspect now, because the culture of your marriage from the very beginning had never involved either of you asking the other for precise numbers, a habit that started innocently and calcified, over years, into something closer to a wall neither of you built on purpose. The first omission is always the easiest one to justify. It's the 5th, and the 15th, and the 50th, quietly stacked on top of that first reasonable one, that eventually builds something neither of you would recognize as honest if you looked at the whole structure at once. The money grew, over the years, in ways that surprised even you, a combination of patient investing and one genuinely lucky early stake in a friend's startup that returned nearly 40 times what you'd put into it, and at every stage of that growth, you made the same small decision you'd made at the very beginning: keep the real number private, share only the vague shape of it. Let Renata believe your family's financial comfort was built on your 2 salaries and reasonable saving habits, which was, again, technically part of the truth, just never the whole of it. You remember, distinctly, the year you crossed $1 million, sitting at this same kitchen table, watching Renata worry out loud about whether you could afford to send your son to the private school he'd gotten into, running numbers on a legal pad, genuinely stressed about a decision that, from where you sat, carried no real financial risk to your family at all. You let her worry. You even added, once, a note of manufactured concern of your own, some line about, "We'll have to be careful this year." A specific, deliberate performance of a shared financial reality you knew, even as you said it, wasn't actually true anymore. The hardest part to admit, looking back, isn't that you hid the number. It's that you sometimes performed a false scarcity right alongside the truth, adding weight to a worry you knew, privately, was already resolved, because the performance was easier than explaining why it wasn't necessary. You told yourself, at the time, that you were protecting her from the specific burden of a number that large, the same burden your own father clearly decided to spare his family from carrying. You understand now, standing at the sink with the open envelope on the table, that you were also protecting something else, something closer to control, the specific comfort of being the only person in the marriage who understood the full shape of your family's actual situation. Your friend Corwin, who you eventually tell the whole truth to over drinks one night, years before Renata ever finds the statement, took the opposite approach in his own marriage, and watching the two paths side by side has haunted you more than you've ever admitted out loud. Corwin came into similar money around the same time you did, a business sale rather than an inheritance, and told his wife the actual number within the same week he learned it himself. No delay, no careful staging of the reveal. He tells you, that night over drinks, that the conversation was hard, genuinely hard, that his wife cried, not from joy but from something closer to grief over years of financial stress she now understood had been, on some level, unnecessary for longer than she'd realized. But he tells you something else too, something that sits with you for years afterward, that the hard conversation, as bad as it was in the moment, was the only version of the truth either of them ever had to manage going forward. There was no second conversation years later. No envelope accidentally opened. No moment where the whole architecture of a marriage had to be rebuilt in real time because it turned out to be resting on a foundation one person never knew was there. Corwin paid the entire cost of honesty up front, in one hard, expensive conversation. You've been paying a smaller, quieter cost every single year since, in installments, without ever once totaling up what the compounding interest on that debt might eventually come due to be. You didn't take his advice, that night, or in any of the years after it. You told yourself your situation was different, your marriage was different, and maybe, in some ways, it was. But standing at the sink now, watching Renata's face do the specific, slow recalibration of someone realizing an entire chapter of her own life needs to be reread with new information, you understand that the difference between your marriage and Corwin's was never really about the number. It was about which of you was willing to pay the cost of honesty at the beginning, instead of at the end. Renata doesn't yell. That's the part that undoes you most, standing there with the dish towel still in your hand, because you'd braced, over the years, for anger, and what actually arrives instead is quieter and harder to sit with. 20 years, she says, not looking at you now, looking at the statement instead, running her finger along the number like she's checking it isn't a printing error. I was scared about the school thing. I remember exactly how scared I was. You sat right there and let me be scared. You don't defend yourself, not right away, because there isn't a version of the defense that doesn't sound exactly as thin as it actually is. You tell her the truth instead, the real one, the one you've never said out loud to anyone but Corwin, that you were protecting something, but it was never really her comfort, not entirely. It was your own sense of control, your own private relationship with a number that had started as your father's secret, and somehow, without you ever quite deciding it, became yours to keep the same way. She's quiet for a long time after that, and you understand, watching her, that the actual damage in this conversation isn't really about the money at all, and it never was. It's about the 2 decades of decisions she made, every worry, every sacrifice, every moment of, "We'll have to be careful this year," built on a version of reality you curated for her, one small omission at a time, and the grief on her face isn't about the $20 million. It's about all the years of a shared life that turn out to have been only half shared, at best, the whole time. The money was never actually the secret that mattered most. The secret was that you decided, alone, what your marriage was allowed to know about its own actual life, and that decision, once discovered, costs infinitely more than the number ever could have. You don't fix this in one conversation. It takes months, actual months, of Renata needing space you don't try to rush, of hard conversations that return again and again to the same central wound, not the money, but the unilateral decision to withhold it, made and remade for 2 decades without her ever once getting a vote. You go to a financial therapist together, An idea that would have sounded absurd to you a year earlier, and you learn, in that room, a phrase that reframes the whole thing for you: financial infidelity, a term for exactly what you did, structurally identical in its damage to other kinds of secrets marriages don't survive, regardless of whether any laws were broken or any money was technically misused. You understand, hearing the phrase out loud for the first time, that you've spent 16 years telling yourself a story about protecting Renata that was never really about her at all. The marriage survives, eventually, changed permanently in ways you're both still discovering, a new baseline of full financial transparency that took real, deliberate work to build, monthly conversations either of you skips now, a joint account structure that makes the old kind of unilateral secrecy nearly impossible to repeat even if either of you wanted to. Renata tells you, months later, on a night that finally feels like the two of you again instead of two people carefully rebuilding something, that the hardest part wasn't learning the number. It was learning that you'd decided, alone, for 2 decades, what kind of marriage you were both going to have, without ever once asking if she agreed. A marriage can survive almost any number, it turns out. What it survives less easily is discovering that one person quietly decided, for years, to be the only one who got to know the truth about their own shared life. You're at the kitchen sink again, a year later, rinsing a different pot, and Renata's at the table, going through the mail the way she always has, except now the brokerage statements come addressed to both of you, and she opens them without hesitation, the way she opens everything now, and reads the number out loud sometimes, casually, the way people read out the weather. You think, some nights, about your father, about the version of this exact scene that must have happened, or didn't happen, in his own marriage, decades earlier, a secret he apparently carried his entire life and never once had to answer for, discovered only after he was already gone and couldn't be asked why. You understand now, in a way you couldn't have before this year, that whatever protected him from ever having this conversation wasn't wisdom. It was simply the luck of dying before the envelope got opened, and you're grateful, in a complicated way you're still working out, that your own version of this story got to end differently, harder, slower, more expensive in the short term, but actually, finally, completely true.